Hello everybody. This is lesson 5 of the lecture International Economics. I will discuss slide 107 to 131 of chapter 1 International Trade. In the last lecture we analyzed how intra-industrial trade between identical countries can be explained by economies of scale. This theory helps us to understand, for example, why Germany trades so much goods with countries like Italy, France or the United States, which have a similar level of development and a similar endowment with production factors as Germany itself. However, there are also other examples that the theory of intra-industrial trade by economies of scale performs well empirically. One such example is the Auto Pact between the USA and Canada agreed upon in the year 1964. By 1964, import tariffs between both countries were that high that there was only a relatively small volume of trade in cars between the United States and Canada. With the same companies operating in Canada and the US, the Canadian auto industry was actually 1/10 smaller version of the US auto industry. The productivity of the Canadian plants was about 30% lower than in the US industry due to the existence of economies of scale. The reason for this gets obvious by taking into consideration that more than one model per production facility had been produced in Canada due to the smaller sales volumes. This made it necessary to close complete production facilities on a regular basis for several weeks in order to retool the production lines. When the free trade zone was established between the United States and Canada in 1964, a restructuring of the entire car industry followed, and Canada General Motors product range was reduced by nearly a half. Nevertheless, the Canadian car industry did not dismiss workers because the production volumes for the remaining Canadian car types was extended. The resulting increase in production of these car types was then exported to the United States, while the cars previously produced in Canada were now imported from the United States. Thus, a massive intra-industrial trade emerged. The following graphical exposition helps to understand what happened. Let us start with the situation where the Auto Pact was not yet enacted. As a result, the car market in the USA and Canada was separated from each other. There was no trade. The car market in the US had a high demand, such that production quantities had been high and the impact of the economies of scale was quite strong. As a result, average productivity in the United States was about 30% higher than in Canada. In Canada, demand for cars was roughly 10 times smaller than in the United States, because the Canadian population of about 34 million people is roughly 10 times smaller than the American population of about 313 people. Therefore, the production of cars was 10 times smaller, and as a result, the effect of the economies of scale was much weaker, such that the average productivity was 30% smaller than in the USA. Since the structure of the demand for cars was basically the same as in the USA, Canada produced the same type of cars as in the US, as you can observe here, same type of cars. The result was a Canadian car industry with nearly the same range of products as in the US, but with a production quantity 10 times lower than the US car industry. As already mentioned, the main producer in both markets, US and Canada, had been the American car producer General Motors. So this was the situation before the North American Auto Pact started in the year 1964. After the Car Pact was enacted in 1964, free trade in cars became possible between the USA and Canada. Both countries developed a common car market since there was no longer restriction of trade in cars by import tariffs. As a result, economies of scale were now fully exploited by a local concentration of the production of the various car types. The production of some car types were concentrated in the USA, such that the production quantities of these types grew larger in the USA. So, production was dislocated from Canada to the USA, and in the USA, production quantities were growing. However, part of production that took place before in the United States was now dislocated to Canada. So here we move the opposite development. Production moves from the USA to Canada, and Canadian production quantities for these car types grew larger. The local excess production was then settled by intra-industrial trade between the two countries. As a result, there was an increase of productivity in the US as well as in Canada. Okay, this was the result of the North American Auto Pact, a reallocation of production between both countries that helped to exploit the potential for realizing economies of scale. The consequence of the Auto Pact between the USA and Canada was an increase of total productivity in both countries and intra-industrial trade, just as predicted by the theory of intra-industrial trade caused by economies of scale. This restructuring process is also reflected by the data. In the year 1962, Canada exported only cars worth 16 million US dollar to the United States and imported cars worth 519 million US dollar from the United States. In the year 1968, Canada exported cars worth 2.4 billion US dollar to the US and imported cars worth 2.9 billion US dollar. Both imports and exports increased drastically. Intra-industrial trade also affected the development of productivity as implied by the theory of intra-industrial trade. In 1970, for example, the Canadian auto industry had almost completely caught up with the productivity levels of the US auto industry. Okay, to summarize the results of section 1.2, the theory of international trade, we can use now the following visualization of trade between the two countries. Case 1 is the case where two countries have the same endowment with production factors. Country A has high capital stock, large supply of skilled workers and low supply of unskilled workers. And country B has the same. High capital stock, large supply of skilled and low supply of unskilled workers. If in this case economies of scale exist, let's say for example in car production, these countries will engage in intra-industrial trade in cars. As just observed in the case study of the Auto Pact between Canada and the USA. Case 2 is the case where two countries have a different endowment with production factors. Country A has again a high capital stock, large supply of skilled workers and low supply of unskilled workers. But now country B has a low capital stock, a low supply of skilled workers and a high supply of unskilled workers. So country B is a kind of developing country or emerging market country, while country A is, as before, a kind of industrialized country. This is, of course, the case of classical trade following the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem. Therefore, the high-tech country A will export, for example, machines, and the low-tech country will export low-tech goods like food, textiles, and so on. So this is Heckscher-Ohlin trade case or classical trade case. Now case 3 deals again with the same kind of countries as case 2. So country A represents again a typical industrialized country, while country B represents now again a typical developing country or emerging market country. The only difference compared to case 2 is that we assume economies of scale in machine engineering. In this case, it is possible that the high-tech country exports primarily high-tech goods as before, while the low-tech country can achieve for a couple of high-tech goods a production volume high enough to compensate the disadvantages in its endowment with production factors through economies of scale. In this case, the low-tech country will be able to export also some high-tech goods to the high-tech country A, plus of course a larger amount of low-tech goods. This mixed case for international trade can indeed be observed for many emerging market countries. To sum up our findings, there are two different reasons for international trade. First, differences in production factor endowment, consumer preferences, or productivity of technologies. These are the reasons for international trade in the classical trade theory. Second reason for international trade is economies of scale in production. And this is the explanation of international trade by the so-called New Trade Theory, developed by the American economist Paul Romer. In the following, we will now examine how government trade policy can intervene in international trade and what kind of consequences this might bring. We will start with an analysis of the two mostly used trade instruments, tariffs and quantitative restrictions. In section 1.21 we compared the ideal types autarky and free trade only. In reality, however, such ideal types are rarely found. Practical trade policy deals primarily with the impact of tariff and non-tariff trade barriers in mixed trade regimes. In most countries, tariffs are not levied as uniform import tariffs, but very differentiated according to individual product groups. The European Union has agreed on a single system of import tariffs in the year 1993. The European Union is therefore a customs union, not only a free trade zone. A customs union practices free trade inside between the member countries and has the same import tariff for every product against outside countries. The extreme differentiation of this tariff system of the European Union stems from the influence of industrial associations and lobby groups. It leads to quite cumbersome customs bureaucracy which consumes a large part of the tariff income. Under the internet address tariffnumber.com, an extremely differentiated list with special tariffs for really all kind of goods can be found. This list is called Tarif, from the French expression tarif intégré communautaire. You can look up this system on the internet. I will make the following example. This is the information we receive for a special kind of good. It's described here with a lot of technical expressions like waterproof footwear with outer soles and uppers of rubber or plastic, the uppers of which are neither fixed to the sole nor assembled by stitching, riveting, nailing, screwing, plugging, or similar processes. In short, we talk about rubber boots. The import tariff for rubber boots is 17%. Here we find the import tariff. So it's quite high import tariff. What are the effects of such kind of import tariffs for the welfare of producers and consumers? We start with the situation with free trade in the case of a small country, such that the world market price is given and represented here by this horizontal line. The difference between domestic production level and the domestic consumption level is covered by imports from the world market. As before, the area above the world market price and below the demand curve represents consumer surplus. The area below the world market price and above the supply curve represents producer surplus. So this is the situation before an import tariff is implemented. If we now introduce an import tariff equal to an amount of money, let's say measured by this yellow arrow per product imported, the domestic price will equal the world market price plus the import tariff. So this will be our new price for goods imported from the world market. I use the shortcut P tariff for this price level. As a result of the higher domestic price, the demanded domestic consumption quantity falls back to this level. The supplied domestic production quantity grows, however, to this level. The difference between the domestic consumption and the domestic production equals imports after the introduction of the import tariff. If we compare now the import volume after the introduction of the tariff with the import volume before, it is obvious that the introduction of import tariffs reduces imports. Before we had this large amount of imports, now we have only this relatively small amount of imports. As a result of the introduction of the import tariff, consumer surplus shrinks to the areas A and B, this yellow triangle now. Before, consumers had a larger triangle, this one here, so they lose this area here, the area between the old world market price and the new price caused by the import tariff. On the other hand, producers' surplus grows now by area C because of the higher price level caused by the import tariff. Producers can now produce more and sell this at the higher price level such that their producer surplus grows by area C. Additionally, we have to take into consideration that the government has now revenues from the import tariff. These revenues equal the level of the import tariff per good, which is the difference between this line and the old price level, so this is the import tariff, times the number of goods imported, which, as we have already found, is this line segment here. So the import tariff tax revenue of the government equals area E. If you multiply this line segment with this line segment, you receive the area, the surface of area E. If we take now a closer look, we observe that two little triangles labeled D and F, which had been part of the consumer surplus before the introduction of the import tariff, belong now to nobody's welfare. They are therefore welfare losses. Triangle F results because domestic consumers have reduced their demand from this level to this level. Triangle D results because domestic production grows from this level to this level after the introduction of the import tariff and causes higher production costs by this amount here. And the area D is the amount by which production costs are higher than the costs to import this amount of goods. So it is a net welfare loss. We can use now again the table to calculate the change of welfare for consumers, producers and the government. In the second column of the table, we describe the situation before the introduction of the import tariff. In the third column, we describe the situation after the introduction of the import tariff, and in the last column, we calculate the change. Before the introduction of the import tariff, consumer surplus was equal to this large triangle, as we have already seen. So it is equal to area A, B, C, D, E plus F. Producer surplus before the introduction of the import tariff was only area G. The tax revenue of the government was zero because the government had not yet implemented an import tariff. Total surplus was equal to this area here plus G. Now, after the introduction of the import tariff, the consumer surplus is equal to only area A and B. Consumers lose all this here. From what they lose, part falls to domestic producers, area C namely. Area G is part of producer surplus as before. So we have producer surplus after the introduction of the import tariff equal to C plus G. The government has now a revenue, a tax revenue from the import tariff equal to area E, as we have already found. Total welfare of all agents in this economy is now equal to A, B, C, E, and G. A, B, C, E, and G. If we calculate the change in the last column, we see that consumers are net losers from this introduction of an import tariff. They lose C, D, E, and F. This, and this. Part of what they lose flows to producers and the government. C flows to producers. E flows to the government. But a net welfare loss remains, the area D and F. They neither flow to the government nor to producers, so they are net welfare loss of the introduction of an import tariff. So our result is we have, as a result, a net welfare loss. If you add up the change over consumers, producers and government, we find a negative effect of an import tariff on total welfare of a country. Okay, so much for this lecture. In the next lecture we will analyze whether quantitative restrictions on foreign trade will cause a similar result or a different result.